Удобные исторические теории. Простые, стройные, известные каждому со школы. Будут опровергнуты. Забытая история.
This is the program Forgotten History. Radio station, Moscow is speaking, 94.8 FM. Olga Baikalova in the studio. Today we continue talking about the end of the world. In the studio is Associate Professor of the Faculty of Mechanics and Mathematics of Moscow State University, co-author of the concept, The New Chronology, Gleb Nosovsky. Gleb Vladimirovich, hello again.
Hello.
In the last broadcast, we talked about the indiction system of time reckoning. We calculated the year 1492, which in the dark medieval times was associated with the end of the world. We even figured out which indiction corresponds to the year 2015. It turned out to be, I believe, 21-1-10.
Yes, but actually, we made a small error in our calculations. We should have first subtracted 1, then taken the remainder, and then added 1 to eliminate the zeros. We forgot to subtract the 1, so we actually calculated indiction for the next year, which starts on September 1st by the Julian calendar or September 14th by the Gregorian calendar. By the way, September 1st is still listed in the Menologium as the holiday, beginning of the indiction or new year. So, at one time, there was such a church holiday on September 1st, the beginning of the year. Today it starts on January 1st. This change in Russia was made under Peter the Great. First of all, I want to thank our listeners who immediately noticed this mistake, and on the same day, it was discussed on our website. It's encouraging that our research is being followed. Actually, we feel that our research is being closely followed, and we won't be allowed to make a mistake. So, thank you. Secondly, I want to use this mistake as an example to show something. Look, we made a mistake by 1 unit and as a result, got an incorrect year by 1 unit. That is, we made an error by 1 unit and got an incorrect result by 1 unit. This is a consequence of the fact that the calculations we were doing were numerically stable. I want to talk a little about that. Numerically stable calculations are those in which, if there is a small error in the initial data or in the calculations, the result also has a small error. Today, science understands what stable calculations are, and understands that unstable calculations should be avoided. They are extremely dangerous. Because even if you carry them out absolutely correctly, there can be a small error in the initial data, in some parameters that you don't know exactly, and so on, and so forth.
But when it comes to the end of the world, such errors are simply unacceptable.
Absolutely correct. That's the point. When we calculated indiction from the year AD, we were doing stable calculations. But the reverse calculations are unstable. That is, when medieval scholars calculated the era from indictions, solar cycles, and lunar cycles which they found somewhere, those were unstable calculations. I repeat, an error of just 1 unit in indiction results in an error of 532 years in the era. An error of 1 unit in solar cycle results in 285 years. An error of 1 unit in lunar cycle results in 420 years. An error of 2 units doubles the error accordingly. The tiniest errors in the initial data magnify errors in the final result enormously. But people back then didn't understand what unstable calculations meant. They calculated, summed, multiplied, and thought that if they did everything correctly, performed the arithmetic operations correctly, they would get the correct answer. Not so. Because if the calculations are fundamentally unstable, they will still get the wrong answer. Because an insignificant, small error can creep into the initial data, which, due to unstable nature of calculations, gets extremely magnified, and in the end, results in an incorrect answer. The founders of our chronology, Scaliger and Petavius, constantly carried out unstable calculations. Another example of unstable calculations is the calculations based on the equinox day. For instance, in old sources, the equinox day is mentioned, stating that a certain event occurred when the equinox day was at such and such a time. The equinox day shifts by 1 day every 128 years. That is, approximately 1 day every 130 years. Suppose the observer and the source made an error by 1 day, then we get an error of 130 years. By 2 days, 260 years.
Wait, but isn't it established now that the equinox falls on a specific date?
The equinox falls on a specific date because our calendar was specifically adjusted after the Gregorian calendar reform.
It was reformed so that the equinox would always fall on March 21st. Previously, there was the Julian calendar. There are Julian and Gregorian calendars. In the Julian, the equinox date drifted.
Drifted?
Of course, it drifted.
Did February 29th exist according to the Julian calendar?
Under the Julian calendar, as well as under the Gregorian, there were leap years.
There were?
Yes, there were.
The Gregorian calendar differs from the old one in that 3 out of every 4 century years are not leap years, while the 4th is. The year 2000 was the 4th one and was a leap year as usual. But, for example, the year 1900 in the Gregorian calendar was not a leap year.
The years 1800 and 1700 were not leap years.
Each time a day accumulated between the new and old calendars.
Every 4th of the century years remains a leap year.
The year 2000, since it was the 4th, remained a leap year, and we just didn't notice it. The Gregorian calendar differs from the Julian one in that it is adjusted to the length of the tropical year, which is the time interval between 2 equinoxes.
There is also the sidereal year, which is the period of the Earth's orbit around the Sun.
The lengths of the Earth's orbit around the Sun and the time interval between 2 equinoxes are slightly different. The Julian calendar sets the length of the year approximately in the middle between these 2 values, the sidereal year and the tropical year.
In fact, it was a very reasonable system, simple, without unnecessary complications and without leaps.
Every 4 years was a leap year, and the length of the year was in the middle between these 2 natural definitions.
But this was not light, so it was shifted towards the tropical year. In general, from a scientific point of view, the reform was pointless.
It sounds like a conspiracy theory. This is so that they can constantly scare us with the end of the world.
No, this is not a conspiracy theory. I just want to say that the calculations made by medieval scholars, including those underpinning the Gregorian calendar reform, were quite incompetent. By the way, we have a specific book on this topic called Easter. It describes everything about the Gregorian calendar reform in detail and so on. I want to say that in old sources, the equinox date is not exact.
It is known that even in the 14th century, the equinox date was recorded with an error of 6 days.
And this wasn't in some random manuscripts, but for example, in the book by Matthew Blasteres.
This is a canonical Constantinople book, and Constantinople was considered the pinnacle, the place where the best scholarly minds of the 14th century gathered.
And they made such errors. In fact, there's nothing surprising about this.
But it's important to understand that errors were possible. Today, some scholars, for instance, our critics, doctors of astronomical sciences, say, let's date the Almagest by the equinox date. This is an unstable method. It can contain a huge number of errors that will lead to instability.
I repeat, when calculating dates, when establishing chronology, it is very important to work with stable methods.
A stable method is like walking on a wide, even road. An unstable method is like walking on a tightrope. One small misstep and you fall.
Gleb Vladimirovich, before we move directly to the end of the world, we have a question from a listener on this topic. I suggest we listen to it.
Okay, let's do it.
To exactly understand the chronology, let's listen to a couple of questions. Please put on your headphones. Hello, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Gleb Vladimirovich. Your methods may be as good and mathematically correct as you like, but you apply them to data whose reliability is questionable. For processing such data, completely different mathematical methods are used, such as fuzzy logic. How do you justify the reliability of your conclusions? Fomenko writes, "It may be true, or it may not be. On what scale do you measure the reliability of your final results, and how do you assess them?"
Thank you.
Actually, I just talked about this. Fuzzy logic has nothing to do with it.
But indeed, the inaccuracy of the initial data needs to be considered.
Therefore, when calculating a certain value related to chronology, it is necessary to take into account that the initial data may be inaccurate. Of course, we constantly consider this. I want to say that a competent scientist today takes this into account, whereas in the Middle Ages, even competent scientists did not, or might not have considered it. Actually, our current chronology is also based on calculations. Don't think it is based on some knowledge handed down from the heavens. No, it is based on calculations.
Just as we use astronomical data today to calculate something in chronology, so did Scaliger and Petavius. They were calculating it.
I will give this comparison once again.
Stable calculations are like walking on a solid, wide road. Unstable ones are like walking on a tightrope.
A millimeter to the right, a millimeter to the left, and you fall.
Calculations performed by Scaliger and Petavius were like constantly walking on a tightrope, and they constantly fell. There are many examples. Competent calculations, of course, should be stable. Naturally, we always evaluate the errors in our calculations.
Alexander is wondering, did Babylonian and Egyptian astrologers who recorded the coordinates of celestial bodies also make errors of several days?
Babylonian and Egyptian astronomers are significantly different matters. Egyptian astronomy indeed left a lot of data behind, which are compiled in the Almagest.
We have thoroughly examined the Almagest and showed that the oldest parts of the Almagest, specifically the Egyptian observations, date back approximately to the 10th century AD. That is the oldest part. It was written down later.
Ptolemaic system itself was developed in the 13th century.
We even have a fairly accurate dating based on the zodiac of astronomy, where the development of the Ptolemaic system is depicted and dated to the year 1228.
The conventional date for the development of the Ptolemaic system in Egypt is 130 AD.
This is an unstable dating method based on the equinox date, which relies on data that had been tampered with to begin with. It is known, and even Robert Newton studied this and showed that the longitudes in the Almagest were recalculated. There are traces of this recalculation, which have been proven.
Therefore, first, longitudes are easily recalculated and could have been recalculated in the past.
Thus, calculations based on them are generally meaningless.
Furthermore, calculations based on longitudes and the equinox date are unstable.
Historians have unstably dated it to the year 130 AD.
We have dated it stably. Our methods are stable. I repeat, the oldest part of the Almagest dates to the 10th century AD.
It was being edited up to the 16th century.
The development of the Ptolemaic system of the world dates to the 13th century. That is regarding Egyptian astronomy. As for Babylonian astronomy, we also studied this. Its significance is greatly exaggerated and inflated. There are no star coordinates in Babylonian astronomy. Yes, the cuneiform tablets contain mentions of planetary conjunctions.
Essentially, these are horoscopes. But they are fragmentary, not sufficiently complete, and besides, the names of the planets are not always indicated and cannot always be fully deciphered.
Even if we set aside these difficulties with the names and assume that historians have deciphered everything correctly, there is still formally insufficient data for dating. The datings proposed by historians are not actual datings.
Essentially, this is again some kind of trickery.
We have written about this in our books.
Gleb Vladimirovich, let's summarize. We're gradually approaching the topic of the end of the world. To understand how the date of the end of the world is determined, we need to understand from which exact moment the world begins. That is, the creation of the world. Then, according to the indiction system, everything resets. The end of the world happens.
No, it's not quite like that. The indiction system has nothing to do with it.
The indiction system was used to calculate the date of the creation of the world, and then scholasticism took over. Since the Lord created the world in 7 days, and 1 day is with the Lord as 1,000 years, if He created the world in 7 days, then it will last 7 Lord's days.
This is the medieval scholastic theory. According to it, from the creation of the world to the end of the world, exactly 7 Lord's days or 7,000 years will pass.
So, if the idea of the end of the world appears and it is scholastic, it immediately casts doubt on religious dogmas.
No, look.
The idea of the end of the world and the calculation of the end of the world are different things.
The idea of the end of the world is not scholastic.
It arose from other considerations.
It has been inherent in our culture from the very beginning.
It is ancient, but the idea of calculating the end of the world is purely scholastic. These are different things. The end of the world itself has been described in many sources. Moreover, the ancients said that the end of the world cannot be calculated. It is known only to God, and you shouldn't try to do it. Nevertheless, people turned a blind eye to these reasonings and still tried to calculate it. And they did calculate it, as I explained last time, which led to great calamities, the death of many people, and severe misfortunes for civilization.
In this sense, I want to say that these calculations are not harmless.
You see, when they touch on such fundamental aspects of culture and faith, they can cause significant harm.
Please tell me, has the idea of the end of the world always been about the complete physical destruction of humanity on the planet?
Yes, the idea of the end of the world has always been about that. Let's look at what is written in the book of Revelation. Although theologians usually try not to associate the revelation directly with the end of the world. However, according to our calculations, the revelation was written 6 years before the year 7000 in anticipation of the end of the world, and the imminent one at that. Look at what is written. And when the 1,000 years are expired, Satan shall be loosed.
This clearly describes the end of the world.
When another millennium ends. It's written directly here. For some reason, being confused by the chronology, theologians have not paid attention to this.
They think it refers to the 2nd century AD, during another millennium since the creation. But here it is written clearly.
And it continues. And fire came down from God out of heaven and devoured them. That is, fire came down from heaven and burned everything.
As I described last time, the concept of the end of the world involves a wave of fire sweeping from the east and burning everything.
The earth will be renewed. There will be a new earth, and the dead will rise. And the sea gave up the dead which were in it, and death and hell delivered up the dead which were in them.
So, all the dead will be resurrected.
And then everything will burn.
And then everything will be renewed. And then the last judgment will begin.
This is all written in the Revelation. And not only in the Revelation. There are many books where this is described in detail. In the Revelation, it is mentioned briefly because it is assumed that the reader already knows it well. In reality, there are books where this is described in detail. It is a church tradition, very well known.
As I said last time, it is quite possible that this tradition is related to some very ancient memories of humanity about the year 535 AD, about the volcanic eruption.
But this is just a hypothesis.
You advised me to read what English language sources say about the year 535. There is indeed information on this. Researchers' opinions on this issue vary. Some talk about a volcano, some talk about a super catastrophe, Some talk about some systemic ecological failure. There are indeed studies about the mystery of the year 535.
I agree. The jury is still out on that subject.
Last time you talked about ice cores, in which fallout of the year 535 is found. They are found in tree rings that live up to 1,500 years, in the remains of some animals. But the period from 534 to 537 is referenced.
It's possible. 535 AD is, of course, an approximate date, but 534 to 537 is not that wide a range.
According to this theory, something happened on Earth over a span of 3 years.
Yes, and perhaps more than 3 years. Because 3 years is the maximum, and the consequences could have lasted longer. This issue needs further investigation. If the volcanic eruption occurred in 535 and was of such magnitude, we know that the consequences can last up to 15 years.
So, it's possible that all these end-of-the-world concepts began to emerge spontaneously by 1492. This includes Dante's Divine Comedy and the Book of Revelation. I understand they were written before that date.
Yes, the Revelation in 1486. We dated it and we have a book called The Number of the Beast, when the Book of Revelation was written. It's a small book, but it's also mentioned in our larger books. The Divine Comedy was written 15 years before the date, in 1477.
1477. Correct me if I'm wrong. There is a hypothesis that all these depictions of the end of the world, where all living things on Earth burn, and humanity is completely annihilated, are echoes of the catastrophe that happened in 535 AD.
From the perspective of the new chronology, this is a natural assumption. Because from the perspective of the chronology we are used to, such a major catastrophe in 535 could not have happened. Such a major catastrophe would have destroyed the civilization described by historians. The 6th century is the time of Justinian, the flourishing of culture, Byzantium, Rome, and so on. Such a catastrophe that would have destroyed civilization is not mentioned in the annals. If somewhere it is written that there was a cold winter, and historians try to link this to the year 535, there are such attempts, but it is not serious.
We have many questions from our listeners. Today we are talking about the end of the world. In our radio studio, we have Gleb Nosovsky, Associate Professor of the Faculty of Mechanics and Mathematics of Moscow State University and co-author of the concept The New Chronology. Hello.
Hello. Good afternoon. I have 2 questions. The first question: when you dated the star catalog, this task can be approached from the perspective of signal reception in general. That is, using a purely correlation receiver. Therefore, from my point of view, in principle, longitude could be used since it mainly involves the relative longitude of one star relative to another. It would be interesting to look at this purely using correlation methods. If you have students or postgraduates, how can these longitudes and correlation methods be used to determine the errors of the instruments that were used back then and the manipulations or recalculations you mentioned? Ideally, they should get exposed as well.
This is question number 1.
And second, a question comment. What you mentioned about the additive number system is, in principle, similar to the Chinese remainder theorem or the residue number system, for which, unfortunately, there is very little literature available.
Thank you.
It seems you enjoy reading popular scientific literature but don't delve deeply into it, repeating some terms from it. Firstly, you clearly haven't read our book on dating the Almagest, which actually starts with a statistical analysis of the errors in longitudes and latitudes, finding the systematic error, compensating for this error, and so on. In reality, mathematical statistics is quite a complex science with many subtleties.
If you had read our book, you probably wouldn't have asked such a question. Moreover, many people like to repeat the word correlation without understanding much about it.
Friends, this is the radio show, Forgotten History. Unfortunately, now we are taking a break for the news. Our guest is Gleb Nosovsky. We will listen to the news and then continue discussing the end of the world, and we will talk about the figure of the Antichrist.
Забытая история.
3:36 p.m. local time. Radio station, Moscow is speaking, 94.8 FM. Olga Baikalova in the studio. This is the program, Forgotten History. Today, we are talking about the end of the world. In the studio, we have Associate Professor of the Faculty of Mechanics and Mathematics of Moscow State University, co-author of the concept The New Chronology, Gleb Nosovsky. Gleb Vladimirovich, before the news, we had a caller who asked two short questions. As far as I understood, one was about longitudes and the inductive numbering system. In the second, he noted that traces of this system exist in China. He called it the residue number system. Frankly, it sounds like gibberish to me. I don't know anything about either of these topics. So, I turn the reins over to you to explain what he meant.
It is indeed a mishmash of poorly connected and largely meaningless words. But, in fact, if we look at history, everything was invented in China, including gunpowder. By the way, in the 19th century, the Chinese published an ancient Chinese table of logarithms that was copied from a European edition, even without correcting the typographical errors present in the table.
It caused a big scandal.
Chinese history is a very interesting subject. This is indeed very interesting, where it all came from.
I refer you to our books, The Piebald Horde, and the chapter on China in the book, Empire.
Additionally, we have a book already sent to the press that will be published soon, titled, The Last Journey of the Holy Family.
It details everything about China and where all ancient Chinese stuff came from.
Let's move on to the next questions.
Wait, did the Chinese also invent the Antichrist?
Are we going to talk about China now?
That's a huge topic.
No, let's talk about China another time. Let's focus on the end of the world. When did the concept of the Antichrist appear?
The theory of the Antichrist appeared later than the theory of the end of the world.
I don't know exactly when this theory emerged, but I want to point out that in Russia in the 17th century, it was widely used to weaken Russian society in the mid-17th century.
В середине 17 века. Вот я открою книгу такую, называется «Книга о вере». Эта книга была издана...
I have here a book called The Book of Faith, published by the Moscow print yard.
So, you are now holding in your hands a book that...
From 1648.
How old? 400 years?
Well,
A little less.
A little less, almost 400 years. Oh la la!
This is the Book of Faith. It was printed in Moscow.
It even says here, by the command of the pious, Christ-loving sovereign, Tsar and Grand Prince Alexei Mikhailovich, ruler of all Russia, and so on, and by the blessing of Joseph, the Patriarch of Moscow and all Russia, printing of this new book has begun.
And so on and so forth. It states here, in the reigning city of Moscow in the year 7156.
Subtracting from 7156. We don't know whether this date was before or after September, so let's assume before. Then we subtract 5508, and we get the year 1648. If it's after September, it's 1647, as we would need to subtract 5509.
But it doesn't matter.
So, it's 1647 or 48.
Usually, when the month is unknown, 5508 is subtracted. Now, let's see what is written in this book, which by the command of the Tsar and the blessing of the Patriarch was published and distributed among the Russian people in 1648.
Listen to this. Little children, it is the last time. And as ye have heard that Antichrist shall come, even now are there many Antichrists. Truly,
many forerunners of the Antichrist have already been, but he himself is already near, according to the number 666.
It is the number of a man, the number of the Antichrist, who knows, maybe in this year 1666 he will appear.
The date is clearly written.
No one will undoubtedly indicate his forerunners or the Antichrist himself, because this is the Antichrist. And so on. Further, it talks about the Antichrist. Look.
2 Numbers, 666 and
It says 666, and from this, the conclusion is drawn, and it is clearly written that soon, in 1666, the Antichrist will come.
How did this date come about? How did the number 666 appear?
666 is taken from the book of Revelation. In the Revelation, it is said about several beasts that will appear before the end of the world. And it is said that one of these beasts will have the number of a man. Here is wisdom.
Let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. So, in the Revelation, the number 666 is called the number of a man. This number was on a certain beast, and thus, through a rather cunning purely propagandistic technique, it was manipulated. Back then, propaganda was mastered no worse than now, and perhaps even better.
In reality, the number of a man 666, 3 sixes, as we have shown, is derived from the actual date of the Nativity of Christ.
Because in the era from the creation, the Nativity of Christ is the year 6660.
According to the new chronology, the year 1152 is the year 6660.
Without the zero, this number is represented by 3 sixes, 6660. In the non-positional numeral system, thousands were depicted the same way as units, with a separate mark. Therefore, 6 in the units place, transformed into thousands, 6 in the hundreds place, and 6 in the tens place, 3 sixes.
These are 3 letters of the Church Slavonic alphabet. In the era from the creation, 3 sixes represented the correct but forgotten nativity of Christ.
So, the 3 sixes are the date of Christ's birth?
Yes, it is the correct date of Christ's birth, the year 1152.
How did the sixes become the number of the Antichrist?
The number of the Antichrist is also 3 sixes.
They just moved the thousands to the units. It's the same letter.
We believe that the author of the book of Revelation understood that this referred to the date of Christ's birth, as it was still remembered.
He speaks of the coming of the Antichrist because the theory of the Antichrist is already present in the Revelation.
It contains the end of the world and the Antichrist.
By that time, some stories about the Antichrist had already been created, and he was already present in the Revelation. Talking about the end of the world, the Antichrist, and the Last Judgment, naturally, he mentions the date of Christ's birth, calling it, incidentally, the number of a man. The fact that it was written on the beast doesn't matter.
In reality, the beasts in the Revelation are astral symbols. He plainly says that it is the number of a man. If you remember, Christ called himself the Son of Man, so there is even some connection here. In any case, purely chronologically, the 3 sixes represent the date of Christ's birth. According to our calculations, in the Revelation, these 3 sixes most likely meant the date of Christ's birth, because it was discussed that Christ came, and that was the first coming, and there would be the second. The Revelation is about the second coming. So, the appearance of this date is not surprising. It was simply misunderstood and distorted. It was claimed that it was some terrifying number of the beast. It's not the number of Christ, but the number of the Antichrist. This theory was implanted. Moreover, the authorities straight out told people that the end of the world would be in 1666 based on the mention of 666 in the Revelation.
And what happened in 1667 when the end of the world did not occur?
In that sense, nothing happened at all then.
What happened? Around that time, the schism occurred.
Russian society was oppressed. There were a large number of self-immolations. People were in confusion, and they did not resist the authorities.
Why? Because they were convinced that the end of the world was near and the Antichrist was coming.
They were told all this in books.
And is this somehow related to the church reform of Patriarch Nikon? There was a church schism at that time.
Related is not the right word. I think these actions pursued the same goal, the destruction of Russian society.
You must understand that the schism and the introduction of the idea of the end of the world were blows aimed at the psyche of society.
It was like a kind of war against Russian society by the authorities of that time, who were actually illegitimate.
We have written about this in detail.
The Romanovs were not legitimate rulers.
By the way, in their first books, they claimed that Mikhail Fyodorovich Romanov was the son of Fyodor Ivanovich, the grandson of Ivan the Terrible. Later, they changed this version. But initially, they started with this version.
In the books of the Moscow print house, they openly declared that they were direct descendants of Fyodor Ivanovich and Ivan the Terrible.
This was not true.
Later, they came up with another version, that they were relatives of Anastasia Romanovna.
You see, lies are not replaced with the truth. Lies are always replaced with other lies. This is a characteristic of people.
I want to say that if in the year 7000, that is, in 1492, the anticipation of the end of the world by the authorities and the church was sincere, then by the 17th century, this was deliberately exploited. After the failed end of the world, it was understood that the calculations were wrong, but it was also understood how strongly this affected society.
Before the year 7000, society was very agitated, put into a trance. Remembering how strongly this affected society, how much it unsettled it, this time they deliberately spread the idea with a direct indication of the date. They just scholastically linked it to the year 1666.
One small clarification. When we talk about the authorities and society as a whole, whether in the 14th or the 17th century, what territories are we talking about? Are we referring to medieval Europe, medieval Russia?
According to the new chronology, until 1613, the rule in the civilized world was unified.
So, when we talk about the year 7000, there was one empire. Of course, it was organized quite in a complicated manner, and local authorities had quite significant rights.
But, nevertheless, at any time, the emperor could come and hang the vassal on the gates.
So, we are basically talking about one great empire.
Yes. But in the mid-17th century, in 1648, of course, it was no longer the case.
The empire had already collapsed, and in its former metropolis, Moscow, the Romanovs ruled, certainly not on their own.
They were the henchmen of the rebels who had dismantled the empire.
Tell me, was the theory of the Antichrist popular only in Russia, or was this topic also touched upon in medieval Europe?
In Europe, the idea was much less prominent, let me put it that way.
As I've already shown in which books, the theory of the Antichrist was heavily promoted in Russia in the 17th century.
Surely, it is present in church tradition, and from quite late times, as I think.
It is present in the Book of Revelation, but it didn't reach the level of hysteria in the West that it did in Russia.
This is the program, Forgotten History. Today we are discussing the end of the world. In the studio, we have Gleb Nosovsky, an associate professor of the Faculty of Mechanics and Mathematics of Moscow State University and co-author of the concept, The New Chronology. Friends, your questions on the topic. Hello, your question to our guest.
Hello. I am astonished by the amateurism of your professor, who claims that the idea of the Antichrist arose only in the 17th century. There are long-standing writings that show the revelation was written in the 1st century, And the idea of the Antichrist was present in the teachings of Christ himself, who stated that false Christs and false prophets would come. When the disciples asked Christ about the end of the world, he warned them that neither the angels nor the Son know this. That is, even he admitted that he does not know this date, only the Father in heaven does.
What's the question?
I get the impression that your professor is ignoring obvious historical facts.
Yes, thank you. We will address this. I understand the question, and I'll rephrase it. There seems to be some confusion because, from our listener's perspective, the Revelation was written in the 1st century. According to the new chronology, the Revelation was written in 1486.
Of course, it's clear that our listener is adhering to Scaliger's chronology, which dates the Revelation to the 1st century.
Moreover, he didn't catch everything I said. We are certainly not claiming that the idea of the Antichrist originated in the 17th century. We assert that it was utilized in the 17th century in Russian society.
The concept already exists in the Revelation, which we date to the 15th century.
Overall, it's understandable that people who are accustomed to Scaliger's chronology and the traditional historical narrative taught from school books have difficulty adjusting to a new perspective, and thus they flounder, as evidenced by this listener.
Alexander Feldman writes, as far as I remember, the Book of Revelation is contained in the Codex Sinaiticus, which is archaeologically 17 centuries old.
Archaeological dating of codices and other ancient objects and books is a serious issue that needs thorough research. This topic is covered in detail in the books by Anatoly Fomenko.
I refer you to these books, read them, and then ask questions.
Gleb Vladimirovich, if we return to the topic of the end of the world, is anyone currently engaged in such calculations? How do historians view this theory today?
No, this theory has long since fallen out of the realm of science. Although, up until the beginning of the 18th century, serious scholars within academic circles did attempt to calculate the correct end of the world. Interestingly, this was done not in Russia but, for example, in England. Maybe it was done in Russia as well, but I'm not aware of it.
By the middle of the 18th century, scholars had stopped engaging in these follies.
Today, of course, it is not considered science.
But I wanted to say something else. I wanted to say that this theory, on one hand, indeed might trace its roots back to true antiquity, to the year 535. Whether this is true or not, the year 7000, or 1492, showed just how sensitive and close to the human heart it is. This is an empirical fact.
People overlook some things, while others they cling to passionately.
This is a peculiarity of human psychology. In 7000, that is 1492, it became evident, showed itself vividly, and in the 17th century, it was specifically used for propaganda purposes against Russian society.
And it was used very effectively, I must say. It was one of the powerful methods of exerting pressure on Russian society in the 17th century.
Look, regarding the end of the world, it's clear that today probably only Hollywood actively exploits this topic, making various religious films. However, when we talk about the end of the world, do we rely only on the Book of Revelation?
No, of course not.
The theory of the end of the world is not only in the Revelation,
it is even more detailed in other sources. There are many apocrypha. There is the Book of Daniel,
which describes the end of the world in detail. There is a book called The Spiritual Meadow, which also talks about the end of the world.
In the church tradition, there are detailed descriptions of the end of the world. I have already recounted them. I repeat, the Quran's last surahs speak a lot about the end of the world.
By the way, let me make another assumption. Why not?
According to the new chronology, Muhammad lived in the 15th century. History shifts. According to the old chronology, he lived in the 7th century, and Christ in the 1st century.
Now Christ is in the 12th century according to the new chronology, and Muhammad falls into the 15th century and aligns with the Ottoman conquest. This means, relatively speaking, it remains roughly the same in relation to Christ, even bringing him a bit closer.
If we look from the perspective of the new chronology at what Muhammad wrote in the Quran, and generally at his activities, it becomes evident that, according to the new chronology, he was of royal lineage. He wasn't some poor desert dweller. According to the new chronology, he was of royal descent and might have known some ancient traditions that existed in this ancient royal lineage.
The very idea of starting the Muslim Hijri era from the flight in 622 could also be associated with some memories that something started in the 7th century.
Such memories might have existed. Later, it was claimed that this was Muhammad's flight from somewhere to somewhere.
Although, according to the new chronology, this was his flight from Moscow, i.e., Mecca, to Medina, i.e., Kazan, where we found the Kaaba.
We have a book, Where Moses Walked.
It tells in detail about Muhammad, about the Kaaba near Kazan, which no one pays attention to today. You can simply go there.
Only the foundation remains of the true Kaaba. I want to say that he probably remembered a lot, and perhaps his Hijri era is somehow connected with vague memories that something started somewhere in the 6th, 7th centuries.
This is the Forgotten History program, with Gleb Nosovsky in the studio. Your questions, ladies and gentlemen. Hello, we have time to ask our guest one more question.
Good afternoon. Michal from Moscow. I am a supporter of the scientific aspect of the new chronology theory by Nosovsky and Fomenko.
Fomenko and Nosovsky.
Please tell me, do you think that the dating of the Shroud of Turin confirms your theory? Because, as I understand it, based on the radiocarbon analysis of the blood traces in the shroud itself, it was dated to the 12th-13th century.
Thank you, Mihail.
Absolutely correct. In the book, Tsar of the Slavs, we have a detailed analysis of the radiocarbon dating of the Shroud of Turin, where we date the era of Christ and, among other things, use the Shroud of Turin for this. There are many different independent methods of dating the era of Christ presented there.
We thoroughly examine the radiocarbon analysis of the shroud.
There are some nuances.
Not all results were interpreted correctly. Most likely, the measurements were accurate, but there were purely statistical stretches.
Nevertheless, if all the stretches are corrected, the dating indeed falls into the 12th century. They stretched it to the 14th century.
In this case, they didn't age it, but rather made it younger. I refer you to our book, Tsar of the Slavs,
where this is written in great detail.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, the program's time is coming to an end. This is Forgotten History. Associate Professor of the Faculty of Mechanics and Mathematics of Moscow State University, co-author of the concept The New Chronology, Gleb Nosovsky, was in the studio. Gleb Vladimirovich, thank you very much for coming. Please come again.
Thank you.